let's go to the radical left in universities, because that's, I mean, you are a product of university environment. You were an associate professor at Harvard for 5 years. You've been at the University of Toronto for almost 20, as I understand it, and now you've been on sabbatical. But the thing that really catapulted you to international fame and really highlighted your voice was your articulation and attack against identity politics in campuses.
That was part of it, you know. I don't really think that's what it is. What it was, what happened was that my lectures online, before any of this political stuff emerged, had 1 million views, 1.5 million views, I guess, by October 2016, which is when I made a couple of videos that were politically oriented. And that did cause an expanding firestorm in Canada and elsewhere. And there were a number of, what would you say, steps in that expanding outward. But really the reason that this has developed is because people came to my YouTube channel to check out the political debate, but they stayed for the content.
To the extent that viewers are aware of you, they're probably aware of you in the context of the controversy of the bill, which was called the C-16 bill in Canada, which was an amendment to the Canadian Human Rights Act and the Criminal Code, and it was intended to add gender identity and gender expression.
Well, that was its stated intention.
That was its stated intention, and your let me just concisely frame this and feel free to correct me. Your objection was actually not an objection to LGBT freedom or to being able to identify in your own life privately transgender individuals as he or she, if you, as a background in clinical psychology, determined that was appropriate for you. But your interest in this bill was the speech compulsion element.
There's two,
right? So you became this.
There was two issues. One was compelled speech. So, which, by the way, was made illegal in the United States in the 1940s by the Supreme Court, right? Unless it's commercial speech, you can compel certain forms of commercial speech.
Compelled speech meaning the government telling you how to speak, what to say, and what is legal and illegal to say. We have a First Amendment in this country.
Even more specifically, what you have to say instead of what you are forbidden to say. So first of all, there's all the things you can say. Then there's some things you're forbidden to say. Then there's the category of things you have to say. Okay, so the Supreme Court in the U.S. decided there was no category of things that you had to say enforced by the government. That ran contrary to the First Amendment, but they did that in Canada.
And in Canada, what they said is there was compelled speech around identifiers for LGBT individuals.
Well, for transsexual people in particular, yes, but it was broader than that, without specifying what those pronouns would be or under what conditions they would be used. So that was the first thing. And what I objected to was the fact that the politicians dared to produce legislation that moved out of the political domain, as far as I'm concerned, into the philosophical or even the theological domain by compelling voluntary speech. And that had never happened in English common law context before. And as I said, it had already been made, illegal, technically illegal in the United States. So that was number one. Number two was, and this was more a consequence of the policy documents surrounding Bill C-16. Okay, it instantiated a social constructionist view of gender into the law. So that's a no-go as far as I'm concerned, because the differences between men and women are not entirely socially constructed. They're not only a consequence of the environment, and the science is absolutely clear on that. And it isn't clear in Canada whether it's even legal to hold that opinion anymore.
You're a clinical psychologist. You treat patients, many different kinds of patients. Have you treated transgender patients?
Not specifically, although I have treated people who've had various troubles with their sexual identities. Troubles with their sexual identities, yeah. Conflicts and crises and that sort of thing.
But in your interactions with people that decide to go on self-identifying in the opposite gender that they were born as, or as their body manifest, you have no problem, I've heard you say, calling them by the pronoun that they choose to be identified with.
Well, it depends on the pronoun. I mean, I've used he and she as requested, as seemed socially appropriate when requested politely. There's a whole slew of pronouns, 70 of them, I think, different sets now, and I haven't been inclined to use those. No one has actually asked me, so it's not like I've rejected a student's claim, which is not to say that I would just kowtow to a student's claim either, because it isn't actually up to you which words I use to address you. That's actually up to me. Now, I might have to pay a price for that, but that's okay. And we don't have our pronouns. Language is a common mode of communication, and it's socially negotiated. It's not something that you decide by fiat, especially not if you're the government.
You talk about social justice warriors on campus and this bullying effect that they have. The best way to encounter bullies is to stand up straight and put your shoulders back.
Well, that's just the best way to encounter the world. I mean, you know, that chapter, which is chapter 1, has been subject to a certain amount of criticism. Apparently, the critics believe that I'm justifying the existence of hierarchies merely by pointing out that they've existed for far longer than the West and capitalism, which is not what I was doing. I was pointing out that they're far more fundamental than the Marxists, let's say, are willing to consider. And this is actually a bad thing. It is definitely the case that hierarchies dispossess people. It's definitely the case that the bulk of the spoils, let's say, from the construction of a hierarchy go to a small minority of people. That's an iron law, but it's not a consequence of capitalism. It's a way deeper problem. And so if you want to address the problem of inequality, you have to do it in a much more sophisticated way than the Marxists manage, because they assume that that's a consequence of capitalism. It's preposterous.
The critics would say that the social justice warriors are perhaps binding together in order to stand up straight with their shoulders back, in order to...
No, they're not. They're binding together in groups to portray the world as a place where people bind together in groups to justify the use of power and to put forward what would you call it? To put forward an ideology that denies the notion that the individual's at the center of the conceptual scheme.
So I have a question about then, at Harvard, for example, there are a group of Asian American students who are suing because they feel that as a group they have been discriminated against, specifically on competency or in merits, right?
That's because the reason for that, though, is because the whole game became about identity politics to begin with.
But then
if
they
wouldn't have started with the, well,
identity politics in order to use that as a tool to combat.
It's exactly what the right-wing collectivists say, especially the white supremacist types. If there's going to be identity politics, we better gather ourselves together in our group and get ready to defend ourselves. It's like, yeah, you play that game and see what happens. It's not a good game.
I see your passion and enthusiasm for this.
It's more like terror.
Well, yes, but you're motivated and you're focused and you're directed at this problem. And I noticed that you've been on sabbatical for 2 years. I sense that the place to fight this is in universities. You've identified universities as creating this problem. And why not go back and fight it at its genesis?
Yeah, I think it's better just to take it directly to people. I think the new media forms, video and podcasts, allow people like me, let's say, to communicate with the broader public in a way that's never ever been possible before, and that's actually much more effective in many ways than the classical university.
In a lot of ways, I understand that. I mean, you reach more people, certainly, and you're talking to people who are interested and might not hear your message otherwise.